Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a really pivotal era in Middle Eastern history.
We are indeed. We're looking at the roughly 6 centuries between the fall of Rome in the West, so 476 CE, and the start of the First Crusade around 1096.
Right, and it's crucial because this wasn't just some empty space in history, it was incredibly dynamic.
Absolutely, a real cauldron of change, you could say. You've got the rise of a major New World religion, Islam,
Huge power shifts, the Byzantine Empire changing shape.
and all these fascinating interactions between cultures, religions. It really sets the stage for the Crusades in a way that often gets overlooked.
It feels like understanding this period is key to grasping why the Crusades even happened.
Exactly. It's like understanding the backstory, the pressures building, the fault lines forming. We need to look at the Byzantines, the incredible spread of Islam, and how they and others interacted.
Okay, so let's rewind then. 476 CE, Rome falls in the West. But the Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople,
Byzantium. Yeah.
it keeps going, right? It doesn't just disappear.
It's not at all. Constantinople remains a major power for centuries. You have figures like Emperor Justinian in the 6th century trying to win back parts of the West.
Ambitious campaigns, but costly.
Very costly. And that's a key point. These efforts, plus these really long, drawn-out wars with their eastern neighbor, the Persian Sassanid Empire.
Right, like that final big one in the early 600s.
Exactly. 602 to 628, it absolutely drained both the Byzantines and the Sassanids, left them weakened.
Like two exhausted boxers, sort of staggering.
That's a good way to put it. Vulnerable, really, to a new force entering the scene.
And before we get to that new force, you mentioned internal Byzantine issues, something about religious tensions.
Yes, and this is really important for understanding what happens next. There were deep religious disagreements inside the empire.
Like the Monophysite controversy?
Precisely. The Monophysite versus Chalcedonian debate was fundamentally about the nature of Christ, one divine nature versus two natures, divine and human.
Seems theological, but it had real-world impact.
Oh, definitely. The official Chalcedonian view, enforced by Constantinople, alienated a lot of Christians in places like Syria and Egypt. They felt misunderstood, even persecuted sometimes.
So this division, it meant Byzantium wasn't entirely solid in those regions?
Exactly. It created less unity. So when the early Islamic conquest began, the reception wasn't uniform. It wasn't necessarily a welcome everywhere, but in some places there was less loyalty to Constantinople because of these prior issues, less resistance perhaps.
That makes sense. Internal problems weakening a major power just as a new one emerges.
Right. So after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632, the expansion of Islam under the first caliphs, the Rashidun, was incredibly rapid.
Astonishingly rapid, wasn't it?
It really was. Think about the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, a huge Byzantine defeat. Syria and Palestine were lost quite quickly after that.
And the Sassanids, the other big power.
They basically collapsed. Already weakened by that war with Byzantium, defeats at Qadisiyah, also 636, and then Neowand in 642, essentially finished them off.
Wow, and Egypt too.
Egypt was also under Muslim control by 642. It's a remarkably swift transformation of the map.
But you mentioned it wasn't purely military conquest dictating everything on the ground.
Well, the military victories were decisive, obviously, but it's nuanced. Some local populations, partly due to those Byzantine taxes and religious policies we talked about, might have seen the new rulers as, well, perhaps a better alternative, or at least not necessarily worse.
Okay, so there's a layer of local calculation involved sometimes?
Yes, it adds complexity. And then there's the administration. How did they govern these vast new territories with diverse populations?
That brings us to the dhimmi system, right?
Exactly. The dhimmi system was crucial. It granted protected status to Jews and Christians, the people of the book.
Meaning they could keep their religions.
Yes, maintain their faiths, their own community laws, property, in return for paying a special tax, the jizya.
It sounds quite pragmatic.
It was. While it did establish a hierarchy, it also provided a framework for coexistence. It wasn't generally about forcing conversion, especially early on. It was a way to manage these complex multi-religious societies.
Yeah.
They even adopted many existing administrative structures.
Okay, so after the Rashidun period, we get the Umayyad dynasty. What changes with them?
The Umayyads take over in 661. They move the capital to Damascus and establish a hereditary system, more like a traditional monarchy.
And the expansion continues?
Massively. Under the Umayyads, the empire pushes west across North Africa, into Spain.
Al-Andalus.
Right. And eastwards into Central Asia, parts of India, becomes this enormous territory.
Facilitating trade and exchange, I imagine.
Definitely. Huge networks open up, but it also creates internal strains.
How so?
There was growing resentment, particularly among non-Arab converts to Islam, the Mawali. They often felt like second-class citizens compared to the Arab elite.
Ah, okay. So political and social tensions brewing beneath the surface.
Yes. And you also start seeing the development of distinct Islamic art, architecture, the Dome of the Rock, for example, a new cultural identity forming.
And then comes another big shift, the Abbasids overthrowing the Umayyads.
Right, the Abbasid Revolution around 750. This was fueled by a lot of that discontent we mentioned from various groups.
And they move the capital again, right, to Baghdad.
Yes, a major shift eastward. Baghdad becomes the new center, and this ushers in what's often called the Islamic Golden Age, especially in the early centuries, say 750 to 900 or so.
The Golden Age, what really defined that period?
It was an incredible time for scholarship, science, culture. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was central.
A center for translation.
Translation and original scholarship. They gathered texts from Greek, Persian, Indian sources, translated them into Arabic, and built upon them.
Like in mathematics.
Absolutely. Think of Al-Khwarizmi. His work gave us algebra, algorithms. Or Ibn Sina, Avicenna in the West, whose medical encyclopedia was a standard text for centuries, even in Europe.
And philosophy, too.
Yes, figures like Al-Kindi. It was a period of intense intellectual ferment, synthesis, and innovation. Trade networks also flourished.
And religious scholarship.
That developed significantly too. The collection and codification of hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet, became more systematic. Different schools of Islamic law began to take shape.
But even this golden age couldn't last forever. You mentioned fragmentation earlier. How did the Abbasid power start to wane?
Well, even during the height of Baghdad's influence, the sheer size of the empire made central control difficult. Provincial governors started gaining more autonomy.
Becoming hereditary rulers in their own right, almost.
Increasingly so, yes. Over time, especially from the 10th century onwards, the caliph's direct political power really started to shrink, even if they retained religious authority for many.
So other powers rise up within the empire.
Exactly. You get regional dynasties carving out their own domains. The Fatimids in North Africa and Egypt are a major example. They even claim the caliphate themselves, a rival Shia caliphate.
Okay, so competition even for the title of caliph.
Yes. Then you have the Buyids, a Persian dynasty, who controlled Iraq and western Iran for a time, even controlling Baghdad and the Abbasid caliphs there.
So the caliph becomes more of a figurehead in some ways.
In many ways, yes, politically. And in the east, you had groups like the Ghaznavids in Afghanistan and parts of Iran. It becomes this complex mosaic of different powers.
A very fragmented political landscape.
Very much so. And it's into this fragmented world that a new group arrives from Central Asia.
The Seljuk Turks.
The Seljuk Turks.
Oh,
They had converted to Sunni Islam and migrated westwards, building up significant military strength.
And they have a major impact on Byzantium, don't they?
A huge impact. Their victory over the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 was, well, catastrophic for the Byzantines.
Manzikert, 1071. Why was it so decisive?
It wasn't just the defeat itself, though the emperor was captured. It essentially shattered the Byzantine defensive system in Anatolia, Asia Minor. It opened the door for large-scale Turkish settlement there.
Leading to the Sultanate of Rum.
Exactly. A Seljuk state established right on Byzantium's doorstep in the heartland of Anatolia. This is a massive blow to Byzantine power and resources.
So, connecting back to the Crusades, this weakening of Byzantium by the Seljuks is absolutely critical.
It's the immediate trigger, really. The Byzantine emperor at the time, Alexios Komnenos, sees his empire crumbling, facing this immense pressure from the Seljuks in the east.
And he looks west for help.
He appeals to the Pope in Western Europe for military aid against the Turks. That's the direct request that Pope Urban II will respond to.
It's important to remember, though, as you said, amidst all this conflict and shifting power, life went on. Relations between Christians and Muslims weren't always hostile.
No, absolutely not. That's a crucial nuance. Throughout this long period, you had centuries of coexistence, trade, intellectual exchange in many places. Spain, Sicily, parts of the Levant itself. It was complex, varying by time and place.
But the Seljuk advance created a crisis moment.
It did. It significantly altered the balance of power and created an acute sense of crisis, particularly for the Byzantine Empire.
Which leads directly to Alexios's appeal.
Yes. His request lands in a Western Europe that has its own dynamics going on. Papal reforms, growing population, knightly class looking for opportunities.
And Pope Urban II sees an opportunity.
He responds powerfully at the Council of Clermont in 1095. His call to arms blends the idea of aiding fellow Christians in the East with the concept of an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem.
Galvanizing this massive response.
An unprecedented mobilization of knights and others from across Europe launching the First Crusade.
And they arrive in a Levant that is, as we've discussed, already politically fragmented.
Yes, the Seljuk dominance was itself fracturing by then, and you had local Arab rulers, the Fatimids still holding sway in Egypt and parts of Palestine. This complex political map actually presented opportunities as well as challenges for the arriving Crusaders.
And they were entering societies that were, in many cases, already multi-faith.
Definitely. Sophisticated societies with long histories of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities living alongside each other, which would be profoundly disrupted by the wars to come.
So, looking back over these 6 centuries, what are the really big takeaways, the major transformations?
Well, first and foremost, the rise and spread of Islam. It fundamentally reshaped the political, cultural, and religious map of the entire region and beyond.
That's undeniable.
Then, the shifting fortunes of the Byzantine Empire, its resilience, its periods of strength, but ultimately its contraction under pressure.
Okay.
Third, that incredible intellectual and cultural flourishing, particularly under the early Abbasids, the Golden Age, its legacy is enormous.
Algebra, medicine, things we still build on.
Absolutely. And finally, I think understanding the sheer complexity of the interactions. It wasn't just one thing. It was conflict, yes, but also coexistence, competition, exchange, indifference sometimes. Grasping that messy reality is crucial context for the Crusades.
It really paints a much richer, deeper picture than just starting the story in 1095.
It has to, really.
So a final thought, perhaps, for our listeners. Given this long, complex history, this deep context of interaction, fragmentation, and shifting power,
Wow.
how might that reshape how we think about the Crusades themselves, their motivations, their impact?
That's the question, isn't it? Something to definitely mull over.
It certainly is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.